Ladies and gentlemen, apparently the best things in life start with an email, because a couple of weeks ago I actually got told that there were some review samples of Acer's new graphics cards, and I thought, Acer? Graphics cards? They don't sell those. I mean, a couple of years ago they did actually release an Intel Art card that we had in the studio, and to be honest I find it to be very expensive and it was very loud and wasn't fantastic, which is why we never really spoke about it much. But I didn't necessarily expect them to come out with some AMD cards. This is a 7800 XT, and the good news there is that I think this is the best all-round graphics card on the market today, not just from AMD but in general. So they've definitely picked a good starting point, but is this actually going to be worth your money? Does it do anything to differentiate itself? Is it going to be loud? Is it going to be quiet? Is it going to run cool? And is it going to have great gameplay performance? Let's find out absolutely everything you need to know about Acer's Bifrost GPU right after a short word from this video sponsor. Get your game on with Zotac's RTX 40 series of graphics cards that deliver serious performance in the latest and greatest games. NVIDIA's GeForce RTX 40 series graphics cards support both DLSS 3.5 super resolution and frame generation, which can not only boost frame rates, but let you unlock higher quality resolutions for stunning visuals. Not only that, but thanks to NVIDIA's RT cores, high performance, real-time ray tracing gives you unreal levels of shadows, reflections and lighting for the true next generation experience. Learn more today with the link down below. Look out! Enemy GPU incoming!
And everyone's left the video.
Anyway, there are actually two different versions of Acer's 7800 XT. This is the Bifrost, obviously has 3 fans, it's overclocked slightly, not by much, and obviously you could just do it on the other card, in theory, yourself with some software. But yes, you'll be paying a price premium for this, but realistically, the main difference that's going to be worth paying for is the fact that it's got a better cooling system. You've got 3 fans on this Bifrost, or the cheaper Nitro version only has 2. I mean, whether you actually need 3 fans, I mean, depends whether you're kind of using headphones or not, and how good the rest of the cooling is in your system. But I'd usually recommend buying a decent cooler, but not going like all out and buying the most expensive versions, Strix, a lot of the time. The presentation of this is very nice. I like the packaging actually. It's quite minimal, but obviously the GPU itself is going to be the meat and bones really of what you're buying, and it's a little bit different. It's a bit plasticky to be honest, but I like the way it looks, which arguably is a little bit more important because you obviously see it rather than feel it all of the time. I can see that it kind of does go along with the Acer theme. I don't know if this sticker is just because it's a review sample or not. If that is standard, that is awful. What are you playing at, Acer? Put it anywhere else. I think it's fair to say that it's definitely not the smallest card in the world, but actually, even if you have a smaller chassis, I think you'd be absolutely fine. I mean, obviously we'll show you this properly a little bit later, but this is a massive case and this doesn't really feel that much of it, but it feels enough that it's not going to look out of place. On the top, you do have 2 8-pin PCIe. Obviously, if you went for an NVIDIA graphics card, you'd have the 12-volt high power connection on most of them now. Flipping this over to its backside, we do have a backplate here that does actually feel, it kind of sounds plasticky, but actually that feels like metal, so that's going to give you a little bit extra rigidity there. Interestingly enough though, there isn't like a pass-through design like you'll find on a lot of graphics cards. I mean, for reference, I mean, we can actually just use this NVIDIA one. Usually when you have the fan now, it sort of goes through the graphics card, especially in a more like traditional chassis. It helps to just get the air up and then out of the back of this, whereas this is much more of your traditional blower that just kind of chucks it everywhere. I doubt it's going to be a concern, but it's definitely something to note. Nothing to speak of on the side. Doesn't look as if there's any like special switches and things like dual BIOS. But on the side, we do have the AMD thing, that's fantastic, which is 3 DisplayPort 2.1s and then an HDMI 2.1 as well, which is great because this is very future-proof. So if you're going to buy a monitor that's going to be 4K, I don't know, like 300 Hertz or something like that, it should support it without the need for display stream compression. But as we know, it's not really proved essential even on something like the 4090. I think at this point it is time for my favorite bit, which is a little bit of a comparison. I mean, this is the Palit 4070 Super Gamerock, the Omniblack that we tested a little bit earlier in the week, and you can see it is much, much bigger than this. But if you went for the top end 7900 XTX from Asus TUF, then this is obviously way, way smaller, despite the fact that these are both AMD graphics cards. TDP on this, they recommend a 700 watt power supply, but if you're using a lower TDP CPU, then you could probably get away with going under this. Whereas obviously something like this is probably going to need an 850 really, or larger to be on the safe side. So also factor that in, and then we'll also grab a couple of other cards for comparison. I mean, the most I guess interesting one is probably this. This is another 7800 XT. This was from Power Color. This is the Red Devil, so this is their high-end graphics card. And actually, I'd say they're relatively similar in volume. The Acer one's a little bit thicker, but then the Power Color one is longer. And actually, I think people would probably rather go thicker than longer because it's more compatible.
I wasn't even trying to say that like that, so get your mind out of the gutter.
Anyway, the last one I want to show you is a 4080 Super, and this actually isn't that much larger, but I would wager this is probably a lot more of a efficient design because you have that pass-through and it's just able to get heat out of your system. But the proof is going to be in the pudding. So shall we get our pudding in? I mean, obviously the first step is making sure that this PC now works, and of course whether the graphics card is actually going to output. Interestingly enough, it's not actually spun up its fans yet. This is usually pretty standard. Graphics cards might do like a test spin when you first put them in your system, but generally under around about 55 degrees. Most cards these days, the fans actually won't spin at all, which is by design, because if they don't need to, why should they? But one thing that I will draw your attention to, for better or for worse, is that this perfectly matches the theme we're going for, which is no RGB, which some people will like, but especially when you're paying like a premium for a graphics card, to not have any extra customizable lights and things, I think is going to be a bit of a turn off for some people. I don't think it matters, and obviously you either like the design or you don't, but it is worth noting that it's not going to be the brightest thing out there. I mean, in a way, it does kind of make your system look a little bit more pre-buildy, which I don't think is fantastic, but again, it's entirely up to you. But enough talk about
Aesthetics.
let's actually get this side panel on and start our game testing, shall we? And what better way to actually start than with some Cyberpunk 2077? I mean, not necessarily an AMD title by any stretch of the imagination, but it's very consistent, and it should allow you to sort of compare this to older GPUs, as obviously it's been out for a while. I mean, they have been updating it, so it's not going to be full apples to apples, but as you can see, the frame rate here is actually very good. This is running ultra settings with FSR set to ultra, but ray tracing is currently disabled. And one of the reasons that I really like this GPU is because it's still very expensive, and you're able to access like really high settings, high resolutions, frame rates, but you're not sort of into, I don't want to say silly money, but you're not into like spending loads of money on things like ray tracing that, let's be honest, not everyone actually wants. And even if you want to run this on like a 4K TV or 4K monitor like we have here, then obviously you can use some of the more aggressive resolution scaling techniques. So this card will support FSR and XeSS, so you can get a really nice looking image and you can make full use of your high-res monitor without necessarily needing to spend double the money on a graphics card just to get nice smooth frame rates. But I will now draw your attention to the top right-hand corner of your screen, where we have all of our statistics and readouts actually from the AMD control panel, which is a pretty nice addition. And you can see not only our frame rate and our frame time, but also how the GPU itself is performing. This is always going to be a good way to sort of gauge whether you're getting your money's worth, and obviously how different cards compare to each other. This card is supposed to boost to just over 2500, but that doesn't mean it's going to do that all of the time. It does it necessarily when it needs to. And at the moment we're sitting just below 2500 at around 2480 or so, but you can see it is fairly dynamic depending on the scene. If you did want to overclock this, there is actually some Acer software, so you can push this a little bit further, but how much further you'll be able to get, we can test it, but don't expect miracles, and certainly much higher frame rates as a result. Temperatures wise, well, as we know, AMD definitely does run hotter than Nvidia, so on an Nvidia card of this sort of caliber, you're probably looking around about 60 to 65 degrees. Some cards will be better, some will be worse. Here we're sitting at about 72. It is quite warm in here, but it's not as hot as we've had in the last few days, so if you live in, I don't know, Nevada or something on a sunny day, obviously expect higher than this. But I'd say this is kind of sitting where I'd want it to be, really. It doesn't need to be any cooler, it doesn't need to be hotter. Obviously our hotspot is around about 85, but this can go like around about 100 degrees or so. This was always going to be a little bit higher. But the good thing, or at least the thing I'm really happy with, currently at least, are the noise levels, because this card is essentially silent, which is fantastic. It's definitely making like a slight hum, but I would say I can actually probably hear the CPU cooler over it, which is great because, to be fair, a lot of a lot of AMD graphics cards definitely do run a little bit louder, especially when you kind of get like the entry-level ones. I haven't tested the Nitro, but it's only got 2 fans. It's going to need to do more work with those fans for the same amount of cooling. And bear in mind, we are at 72 degrees at the moment, and that's probably where the card wants to keep itself. I would say you're probably going to notice not necessarily significant, but there is going to be a difference between that 2 fan card, the Nitro, and then this 3 Bifrost version. So if it's not that much extra money, I would probably recommend that you go for this, but you do start to get into diminishing returns, and obviously the more money you spend on a graphics card, the closer you get to like the next rung up. So it's always going to be a little bit tricky. Shall we see exactly how this performs with some ray tracing though? And I will be honest, I'm not expecting miracles even at 1440p. We won't turn path tracing on because that's basically a death wish on this particular GPU. Give it a second to sort of reload, and then what is the reality going to be? Around about 47 to 50 FPS or so. So definitely noticeable. Whether the lighting is as noticeable, it's difficult to say. I personally would much rather play at 70 FPS, 75 FPS with ray tracing off than all of the bells and whistles turned on. Obviously, if you're taking photos and things, then that's going to be different. Alternatively, you could turn some of the ray trace settings down. This is what I did on my RTX 3080 when the game first came out. I actually had ray trace shadows and everything else disabled, and I was able to get a decent frame rate. Or obviously, you can aggressively tune the FSR a little bit. But the problem with doing that is you can then make any graphics card look great, even with ray tracing. Whereas as soon as you turn the FSR down from quality below at 1440p, well, the drop in the resolution is definitely more noticeable than the lighting that you're gaining. So I'd probably aim for around about 60 to 70 FPS, and if you can turn some of the ray tracing settings on, fantastic. But generally speaking, this is very intense, and ray tracing is not really your friend here. But of course, from our ray trace single player title to our proper intense multiplayer, this is some Apex Legends, and we're now running this at 4K. And as you can clearly see, this is a very, very impressive GPU. I mean, around about 170 FPS, depending on when and where you are in the title, really ain't bad, especially bearing in mind this is, again, at 4K without any image scaling techniques. But it really does sort of go to show that even if you want to be future-proof and you're getting a DisplayPort 2.1 GPU, there are going to be certain instances where you may well be able to use it, especially if you are playing more esportsy titles. Whether that's the right choice is questionable, but obviously we're all completely different, and it's just nice to have something that is very flexible. Because, don't know about you, I primarily play multiplayer like 90% of the time, and then a new game will come along and I just want it to be able to sort of play the game with as higher settings as possible, but I don't need a graphics card that can run every game at max ultra ray trace, as long as the games I play all the time can run at a really high frame rate. So I think around about 140, 150 FPS that we get at the moment at 4K in Apex really ain't too bad. But I mean, to be fair, maybe we've been a little bit too easy on this GPU. We've tested Cyberpunk, which is a little bit older, and we've gone for multiplayer. So how about we test something that has literally just come out? Look at the timing as well with that loading. This is this is Ghosts of Tsushima, and obviously this is an ex-PlayStation title, but we've currently got this set to 4K, but we are using FSR 3, which is actually baked into this natively, and we've set that to performance, and I don't think this looks quite as good as DLSS would over on the Nvidia side of things, but it has got so much better. It is genuinely quite impressive now, especially if you are going to be playing this on like a larger screen or you're sitting like further away from it really. And we're currently getting around about 100 FPS or so, so obviously way better than you were going to get on console, and obviously you can crank up the settings as well to get something that looks even better too. It's a really impressive looking title actually, and it's definitely something that I look forward to playing personally. But of course, because this is a title that actually supports FSR 3, it does also have frame generation inside it as well, which might be confusing to some people because you might think that's an Nvidia thing, but actually there is an open source, or at least an open version that's used at the moment by AMD. It's just called AMD frame generation really. So you go into the graphics options and scroll all the way down, then you realize it's actually under display, not graphics, always confusing. Here you can see our settings, FSR 3 performance, but go all the way down to the bottom and you have frame generation, and there it is, FSR 3 frame gen. And we will turn this on, and then in practice you should notice that the overall smoothness of the image will improve, but the latency will take a slight hit. And it's absolutely fine if you're playing a single player title and you've already got a decent frame rate to start with, but one of the things I don't like about the advertising of this current generation of graphics cards on both sides is they think they can turn like 30 into 60 with frame gen and everything's great, because it's not, because the game will actually then feel slightly worse than if you were playing at 30 FPS, which is something I think a lot of people they know, but they don't quite understand, but that is just the reality. And I have got this turned on now, and I can confirm that the game still feels really nice. It certainly looks like there's no obvious artifacts and things. You'll definitely start to notice some if you're looking for them and you sort of move the mouse very quickly around. But I mean, generally speaking, I've not really had any real world issues using the frame gen technology beside the latency issues. I was hoping that we'd be able to get some latency readout from this, from frame gen lag, but no, apparently frame gen lag doesn't work in this frame gen for some stupid reason. In practice then, this is very much a frame smoothing technique, and as you can see, it has increased the frame rate to around about 150 to 160 FPS. So say what you will about frame generation, it's still a nice feature to have. You can get versions available. It's just not going to work in every single game, because in practice, it's always going to work better if it's actually baked in from the developers, whether it's from AMD or Nvidia, and there's, at the moment at least, a lot more titles using frame generation from Nvidia than from AMD, but hopefully that will change. This is actually a version that has both, so if you were using something like a 4070 Super, then you'd be able to use Nvidia's version or AMD's, which is a nice thing. But ladies and gentlemen, I know, you want some hard numbers. This ain't good enough, and there's only one person that I know that can actually deliver the information that you guys crave, and his name is Benchmarcus, who's definitely not me once I've done all the testing after filming this. That is right, everyone, I am back. This is Benchmarcus, and yes, as you can clearly see, it is a pretty impressive bout across the board, really. I mean, this is a graphics card that I would say does punch above its weight. I love the fact that this has 16 gigabytes of VRAM, whereas something like the RTX 4070 only has 12, so do bear this in mind if you are going to be playing at higher resolutions. And while it definitely isn't the absolute best of the best, there's not really a game here that I'd say it can't handle. I mean, the latency figures for Hogwarts Legacy, I didn't really like playing this with ray tracing, and it is something I would turn off, but just as an indication, it does go to show that it is a very flexible graphics card. Now, flipping this round and almost comparing it against itself, we do have that Power Color Red Devil card, and this is very similar in terms of cost. In fact, in a lot of cases, you can actually get it for slightly less, and unfortunately for the Acer card, this is where things do take a turn for the worse, because whilst the frame rate and the FPS is essentially the same in every single test, you're always going to get some variance in the 1% lows. It doesn't really matter which card you have in your system, the experience is essentially going to be the same. However, when you look at the GPU temperatures of these cards, unfortunately there is actually quite a big difference between the Bifrost and the Red Devil. 6 degrees as measured, and you might be realizing, well, why have we got a max temp of 70, bearing in mind we saw like 71, 72. Well, I did these benchmarks in the evening when the temperature had dropped down, windows open, so it's as fair as it possibly could be. Now, zooming this out and actually comparing the 7800 XT in general to all of the other cards, full disclosure, this is not the Acer specifically, but as we saw, performance is going to be essentially the same. We tested a few months ago all of the graphics cards essentially, and my opinion hasn't really changed that much. It's still going to be dependent on pricing, but AMD's cards tend to be the best offerings if you want the largest amount of VRAM possible, or just the best price to performance. Those are the cards to go for, especially if you're mainly playing multiplayer titles or something like that. Whereas if you want a little bit more of an all-rounder, or specifically you're going to be playing single-player titles, you want the AAA experience, you want all of the ray tracing settings and things turned on, then obviously Nvidia is going to be your best bet here. But I would say be very careful around something like the 4070, especially the 4070 Super, because that 12 gig of VRAM at 4K is going to pose a problem in the years to come, in my opinion at least. Whereas if you go for something like the 4070 Ti Super, you get 16 gigabytes of VRAM, more performance, you can still use DLSS 3 frame generation, and I'd say that is a card that is going to last. But obviously you are going to have to pay for that. So those are your options, but I still think that the 7800 XT is a fantastic choice, maybe just not the best value when it comes to this Acer version. Rightio then, ladies and gentlemen, definitely some interesting stuff there, and I don't want to say I'm disappointed, but I'm a little bit disappointed, right? Because there's nothing wrong with this per se, right? I mean, if you were to buy this and you had no context of any of the other products at all, I think you'd be really happy. I mean, yes, it is a little bit plain. The temperatures, they're not on the high side, they're just higher than the competition. And price-wise, obviously, it's higher than the competition. But it's just, what's the reason to buy this if it's more expensive than the cheaper variants, yet doesn't perform as well as something like the Red Devil that you can get for about the same price, if not slightly less? Obviously, it looks a bit more bland, doesn't have the lighting and stuff on it. I don't think it's a bad effort by Acer. As I say, I think you'd be happy with it. I'm just, as I say, struggling really to think of a reason to recommend it. I can't explicitly recommend this unless you can get it for a great price. So if you see this in the sale, then it gets my wholehearted recommendation. But for everyone else, it's not bad, but doesn't really do anything unique. I will also say that there is some software that comes with this as well if you do want to overclock it. But when I downloaded it and actually put it on the system, all you could actually do was to adjust the power slider and not a whole lot else, which is completely pointless when you think the AMD driver actually allows you to do way more in-depth overclocking, and you wouldn't have to do any additional downloads at all. So clearly that's a work in progress. Would like to see more on that Acer, but for the time being, I don't see why anyone would go for that. But I would love to hear your thoughts on this. What do you make on Acer's first attempts at a graphics card? And if you are actually in the market for a new GPU, which one do you think you'll go for? I mean, I'd also like to say, of course, that if you are looking between like a 4070 from Nvidia or something like a 7800 XT, then for me, the fact that you do get extra VRAM with this is definitely a big boon. I mean, I like the performance of the 4070 and the 4070 Super if you're going to be playing AAA ray trace titles, but the 4070 Super, for me, it's not the one I would wholeheartedly recommend because I think 12 gig of VRAM is kind of pushing it for that sort of price. So I'd recommend you either step up to the 4070 Ti Super, which, as I say, is my favorite Nvidia card at the moment, or just save yourself the money, get the 4070 and maybe just upgrade a little bit super. That's a good joke, a little bit sooner. But smash the like button if you've enjoyed this, get yourself subscribed. And if you do want to check out current pricing on anything featured in this video, or maybe check out the best GPUs in our full comparison video, you can find that listed down below with our affiliate links. And while you're down there, why not check out Zotac's 40 series of Nvidia GeForce graphics cards? This RTX 4070 Ti Super is perfect for AAA titles, with massive performance in your favorite games. The Trinity Black Edition packs the Ice Storm 2.0 advanced cooling system, with active fan control that stops spinning at lower loads and awesome Spectra RGB lighting. It really does look incredible both on and off the screen. Get yours today with the link down below. But thank you so much for watching this video. We'll catch you in the next one.